Now that we've talked about perfectly competitive markets, let's switch and look at something at the complete opposite end of the spectrum, a monopoly. So people use the word monopoly a lot, and I don't think they really know what it means. So we're going to start off with a definition. First, a monopolistic market must consist of exactly one seller. No sellers, and it's not a market. More than one seller, and it's not a monopoly. It's something else. So there must be exactly one person producing the item. There also must be something that the product can't have any close substitutes. So nothing that you could easily use for it. This is one of the harder ones to identify. So a lot of times people will claim something like Apple has a monopoly on iPhones. Well, yes, Apple is the only person who makes iPhones. However, there are close substitutes, or close enough, depending on the person. Right? There are phones that do similar capabilities and have similar other desires. So because of that, in a monopoly, since they're the only person making this thing that nothing is like, it must have extremely high barriers to entry. Right? No new firms can enter. So we'll talk about several different of those barriers as well as different firms that are a monopoly. As I sit here with no power, I can't help but think of Duke Energy as the monopoly provider for electricity in my house, at least house-wise. Like, you can get a generator that powers some things for a short period of time, but it's not a very good substitute. Right? After these couple of days with no power, I have no intention of calling Duke and saying, forget your electricity, I'm going to use the generator. That's not something I'm even remotely contemplating, and I don't think any of you would either. So there's one option for power to my house. It's Duke Energy. There's nothing quite like electricity, and there are a lot of barriers to entrances into the power production. So we'll talk about why in the next slide. So monopolists are called price searchers because they can choose their favorite price on the demand curve. So we call perfectly competitive firms price takers because they observe the market price and then that's the price they charge. Whereas here, a monopoly can look at the demand curve for their product and choose their favorite price on the entire demand curve. This is not the same thing as saying a monopoly can charge any price they want. So they cannot choose any price and quantity they want. They are restricted by demand. They can choose any price and quantity on the demand curve, but they can't choose any price, right? If the maximum any person is willing to pay for an item is $100, they can't charge $150 and actually make a sale. We still have voluntary exchange in our market. So you can't charge more than someone is willing to pay for something. So on the last slide, we talked about how there has to be a barrier to entry. So there's 4 main types of barriers to entry that we see in monopolistic markets. First are legal barriers, and this is when the government grants some type of a right by a firm to produce something, and no one else can do it. So this eliminates competition by law. For example, the United States Postal Service. So it is illegal for anyone to touch your mailbox other than the postal worker, you, or an authorized agent. So your neighbor if you're out of town and you ask them to get your mail, something like that. It is a federal crime to do anything to a person's mailbox that is not your own, right? And so because of this, someone can't start delivering in mailboxes, even though I have gotten Amazon packages in mine that weren't delivered by the Postal Service. Technically, that Amazon package person or delivery person broke some federal laws. So if you ever do that as a side job, mailbox is not yours. Anyways, the reason for this is because they want you to be able to have a secure way of transmitting information or packages. There's some massive legal recourse, more than just someone took a piece of paper, if they do it. That's why whenever you send in your taxes, they encourage you to do it via USPS certified letter or something like that, so that you have hard evidence that it was handed to them, and then it's the government's fault, essentially, if your taxes don't make it, no longer yours. So that's a legal barrier. Another type of barrier is a patent. A patent entitles the person to be shielded from competition for a certain period of time. Usually they're about 20 years. Sometimes you can get a patent extension depending on what type of patent it is and what you're doing. And the purpose of this is to encourage innovation. So a lot of new medicines fall into this category. It takes a lot of money in research and development to develop a new medicine, especially a completely new medicine to treat a new condition or a previously untreated one. And so because that research and development is so costly, they have to be able to have a higher reward at the end than just the price. That's why the price to produce an individual pill may be 10 cents, but you pay $20 for the pill. Because you're not just buying your pill, you're buying all the R&D, or your share of it, that went into that pill. But over time, these patents expire, and that's when we get generics. So this is something like medicines. Okay. Economies of scale is the third type of barrier to entry. And this is where a lower average total cost is obtained through larger scale production. If a company serves just a few more customers and a few more customers, their average total cost constantly decreases. It never turns up, so there's no minimum point of it. Economies of scale occur whenever it's so pronounced that in an industry only one firm can survive. We call this a natural monopoly, meaning you start out with lots of firms, and then for cost savings purposes, they'd merge and merge and merge, and you'd only have a few. Think cell phone service providers. Originally, when cell phones came out, or soon after, there were lots of different people with similar technologies. But then because people wanted service in more and more places, firms negotiated and had contracts with each other and then merged because it was so expensive. And now there's really just a few different cell phone providers. There might be a lot of different names slapped on it, but there's just getting you the same old Verizon, Sprint, etc. towers. There's not actually that many different ones as there were originally. So cell phone providers is one in this. Another example, since there's still multiple, I'm going to go with Duke Energy, since I started talking about them earlier. Right, so it's very costly to build power plants, power lines, maintain those power lines, and even for the people driving through town, imagine if we had 5 different power companies and you would see power lines all over the place. Or at least this is the justification as to why we only allow one electric company. I recently learned, as in last summer, that Texas actually has competition in their energy providers, similar to like we do with our cable or TV or internet, depending on the area. And that's a little crazy seeming just because there's this justification, but it seems to be working fairly well. People have lower costs for energy, which tends to happen with competition. And then the last justification or barrier to entry is exclusive ownership of a necessary input. So this means only one firm can produce this item because they are the only one with an input, and not just any input, a key input. For example, we're going to talk about De Beers diamonds. So De Beers diamonds owned all diamond mines, or at least all known diamond mines. And so by owning diamond mines, a extremely key input into diamonds, They were the only place you could get a diamond from. So if you wanted a diamond, you had to get a De Beers diamond. There weren't any other options. I think that has changed now, but that was the case. So we've talked about a monopoly, how one is set up, and how they make their different production decisions, the fact that they look for their favorite point on the demand curve. Now let's talk about how they determine what is the favorite point. So we've got a table here to our right. This essentially is a demand curve. It's got the relationship between how much a price of an item is and how much people are willing to purchase. So let's find their total and marginal revenue. So total revenue is price times quantity, right? If they charge $11 each and sell 0 of them, they make $0. If they sell 1 at $10, they make 10, 2 at 9, they make 18, 3 at 8, they make 24, 4 at 7, they make 28, 5 at $6, make 30, 6 at $5 is also 30, and 7 at $4 is 28. Then if we want to find their marginal revenue, this is the change in the total revenue. So there's nothing before that one, but when they go from making none to 1, they go from making $0 to $10, so marginal revenue goes up 10. When they go from making 1 to 2, their total revenue goes from 10 to 18, so their revenue changes by 8. When they go from 2 to 3, their revenue goes from 18 to 24, which is a change of 6. When they go from 3 to 4, their total revenue goes from 24 to 28, change of 4. 4 to 5 is 28 to 30, which is a change of 2. And then the next one is no change. And then the last one is that it decreases by 2. Okay, so before, with a perfectly competitive firm, we had a constant marginal revenue, right? Because they just had to take the market price. But here, they actually don't have a constant marginal revenue because they can change their price and quantity based on the demand curve. So if we wanted to sketch out what was going on here, this starts at $11, and our demand curve goes down something like that, right? The marginal revenue curve, though, is a little different. So if we were to compare the price, well, we'll come back to that now that I'm thinking about it. So let's talk more about the shape. So the marginal revenue curve actually has the same intercept as the demand curve, meaning that 11 in our sketch over here is the intercept for both demand and marginal revenue. However, the marginal revenue curve falls at twice the rate. So you can see here our price is going down by $1 with each quantity, whereas our marginal revenue goes down by $2 at a time. So that has that relationship. And this is, in general, going to be true. It has to do with the fact that optimizing your marginal revenue and how the calculus all works out. So I hate saying it's in the calculus, but it is. The reason it's going down steeper is because they're not just, every time they lower their price, they get to sell more. And yes, they make $1 less on that item in this case, but they also make $1 less on all the previous items. And so the marginal revenue shows that relationship. So in equation form, this is the equation for that table and graph that we have. If we wanted to find the equation for our marginal revenue, instead of writing Q, we would write 2Q. So that becomes 11 minus 2Q. The same would be the case if, say, our demand curve was 40 minus 3Q. Then our marginal revenue would have the same intercept of 40, and we'd have to double that number in front of the Q. So that's what you do with all of them. You just double the number in front of the Q, and that gives you your marginal revenue equation. And that's because it starts at the same place as demand, but falls at twice the rate. So now that we've looked at what the marginal revenue curve is shaped like, we can start talking about where the monopolist is going to want to produce. So we said in our last section that all firms want to produce where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. In fact, I said this is super important. If you're going to only remember one thing from the month of April, this is the thing you should choose. Okay, so that's what they're going to use to choose. So they're going to choose their quantity. Then based on that quantity, they're going to charge the maximum price possible given that quantity. So not literally the top point of the demand curve, but they go up to the demand curve. So let's look at it in a graph. So this is our demand, and this is our marginal revenue. And our marginal cost looks something like this. If we're looking for our profit maximizing condition, that's going to be where our marginal revenue and marginal cost are equal to each other, which is right there. This tells you how many a monopolist will produce. But they don't want to charge that price because they're leaving money on the table. They want to go up to the demand curve, and this is the price that a monopolist charges. So let's compare the monopoly to what our perfectly competitive firm would have done. Well, they wouldn't have been able to choose their favorite point on the demand curve. They would have had to just go with out here. So this would be the quantity that perfectly competitive firms would do, and this would be the price that a perfectly competitive firm would do. So by having a monopolist, and this is the reason people ultimately complain, is that they charge more for each unit because they have market control and they can choose their most profitable point on the demand curve. And they're also going to make fewer units. So these are really the big sort of complaint regarding monopolies, is that they make things too expensive and there's not enough to go around. And so it's a good time to think back at what the type of monopolies were. So if we're talking about electricity or water or medicine, having less of it available is a little bit something that people don't really like to think of, right? So there's this push to try and regulate them. But that is a topic for another class. So how do you deal with all of this? What's the ultimate problem? Well, it makes people produce too little. And so it causes, you guessed it, a dead weight loss. All of these are mutually beneficial to produce and sell because they're worth more than it costs to produce. In fact, the monopoly would love to be able to sell those units. However, it's just too costly in that they have to cut back the amount of money they make on the previous units. If there's a way they couldn't, then they would produce more. More on that in a moment. So what is the problem with monopolies? Dead weight loss. Society is worse off whenever the monopoly produces and where it wants to, as opposed to where the perfectly competitive market equivalent would produce. So even the monopolist would love to be able to sell those units, but they just can't because it's too costly. Costly in that they would lose way too much money to make it worthwhile. They make more by staying where they are. So from society's point of view, the monopoly underproduces. But, right, that's because they're making less than society wishes they would, less than a perfectly competitive firm would. But the monopoly is doing right by itself. So it's doing the best it possibly can, but that doesn't mean society as a whole is happy about it. So is there a way or a possibility where this dead weight loss doesn't exist, or at least gets smaller? That's what we're going to talk about next. So far, we've assumed that Monopoly sells all of its output at the same price, right? They have to choose their favorite price and charge that to everybody. But that's not always the case. Sometimes monopolists can segment the market and charge different people different prices. Sometimes that is considered price discrimination. Specifically, it's price discrimination when sellers charge different prices for the same product, and the prices don't reflect cost differences. So what is not price discrimination is a McDonald's in Manhattan charging $3 for the same burger you can get at the McDonald's in Clemson for $1. Right? That is not price discrimination because it's a lot more expensive to have a McDonald's and to serve that burger. Right? It's harder to get deliveries, it's more expensive, you have to pay your workers more, your rent is higher than it would be in the Clemson store. And so all of that makes the cost to serve different. So yes, it's the same burger, but the costs are indeed different. What is price discrimination is when you go to the movie theater, you flash your student ID card, and you pay less for a movie than, say, the family waiting in line next to you. That couple, they pay full price for their tickets, even though you go sit in the same theater in virtually the same seat to see the same movie at the same time, and it's not more expensive for that couple to be sitting in the seat than for you. And so because of that, that actually is price discrimination. So there's an extreme version of price discrimination called perfect price discrimination. And this is when you can charge every person a different price, specifically their marginal use value. So this is when you know exactly how much something is worth to somebody, and you charge them that price. This turns the marginal revenue curve into being the same as the demand curve. And that's because you don't have to cut the price on the previous one. You keep it the same. So if we were to draw perfect price discrimination, here our demand is the same as our marginal revenue. Here's our marginal cost. So that means this first person that wants to buy the item, you charge them that price, even though it costs you that to make it. The second person, you charge them that price, even though it costs you that much to make it. And the third, and the fourth, and the fifth, and you would keep going until you got here, which is the efficient level of production. So this is good in that it leads to no dead weight loss. Right? There's no longer an underproduction of this good or service. The right amount is produced. However, that green area I just outlined goes entirely to producers. So there is no consumer surplus. Yes, they will still buy it, but they don't walk away knowing that they got it for a deal or something like that. And so perfect price discrimination is a little harder to find a real example of because we have laws and regulations and trying to keep that from happening in America. Also, determining each specific person's marginal use value is very challenging. And on top of that, it has to be something you can't resell, right? Like if it was a bag of apples, then the person that is willing to pay down here could buy it and then turn around and sell it to the second person up here and make a little money, and the second person gets it for cheaper. They're both happy. So it's got to be something you can't resale. So one of the best examples comes from church history, actually. So back before the Protestant Reformation, the main church in existence for for Christianity was the Catholic Church. And so because of that, there wasn't really any competition and they were a monopoly. So one of the ideals of Catholicism is the fact that when you die, you don't go straight to heaven. This could have changed, but back pre-Reformation, they heavily believed in purgatory. And so purgatory was like sort of this eternal waiting room until something happened to get you to heaven or somewhere else. So people would literally buy from the church a get out of purgatory certificate for their loved ones who had passed on. Also, the church was very involved and therefore it knew the incomes of every single person who was a part of the parish. And so they could determine a person's marginal use value, the maximum they'd be willing to pay. Also, the get out of purgatory certificate only went to the specific relative it was purchased for, so you couldn't resell it. So it was one of the rare cases that they had the opportunity to perfectly price discriminate because they knew what people were willing to pay and you couldn't resell it. And so this caused a lot of interesting things to happen. And so there are actually records showing that they had these charts sold. There's even a quote from one of a relatively high-ranking member of the Catholic Church saying, "Another coin in my coffer rings, a soul from purgatory springs." Had a nice little rhyme for it. So this is very well documented as something that happened. So essentially, at least in this dimension, the Catholic Church was stealing a lot of the consumer surplus because it was acting like a perfectly price discriminating monopoly. And that led the perfect opening for Martin Luther to start the Protestant Reformation. So this is what you're going to be doing this week instead of the discussion. So it's similar to last week in that it is a worksheet we would have done in class, but don't have the opportunity to do in class. So in lieu of a discussion, I want you all to do this. I'm going to go over some basic things and make sure you know what is expected of you on it. So we've got a table about the Moonglow Monopoly Company, and we have some missing information. This time, instead of having it straight down, they're all over the place. So you're going to have to use a little logic to figure out what goes through. So if you're in a box and you can't figure out what goes to that box, move to the next one. You might not have the other pieces of information yet, but there is enough information on this table to finish all of it. But there's a few things you should probably know first. So first, whenever we talk about the demand curve, we're talking about those price and quantity, right? Because it says you're supposed to graph the demand, the marginal revenue, the marginal cost, and the average total cost. So that's these four with quantity in the chart on the right. Okay. And so just as a little reminder of some formulas you might find useful, total revenue is price times quantity. That also means if you don't have the quantity but you have total revenue and price, you could shift things around to be able to make that happen. So that's the same thing as saying price is total revenue over quantity, or quantity is total revenue over price. Or you might have to move these things around somewhere. Profit is total revenue minus total cost. And again, you might have to move things around to be able to figure out which is which. Average total cost is total cost divided by Q, which also means Q times average total cost is total cost. So that might be one of the ways you need to figure out the total cost. Marginal revenue is the change in total revenue. So total revenue is the sum of the marginal revenues to that point. And marginal cost is the change in total cost. So it is the sum of the marginal costs up to that point. Okay. So fill in what you can. If you had a point where you can't figure out what to do on one, keep moving through. You can't go in order, but there is enough information to be able to finish the chart by the end. And then once you're done, you'll want to plot out in this graph those 4 columns I selected. So for example, the first one in our demand curve is a quantity of 0 and a price of $13.50. So that point is there. And then we don't have 1 and 2 yet, but we do know 3 is at 900 and 5 is at 600. Okay, so there's a few points. So you might even be able to guess, but I encourage you to continue doing the math to be able to get what goes in those places. Then you would connect them, get your demand curve, do the same thing with average total cost, marginal revenue, and marginal cost. Okay. Then there's some questions. The first one is to maximize its total profit, how many should it produce? To answer that, you're going to need to look and see where your marginal revenue and your marginal cost are equal. And then you're going to look at the quantity that goes to that. So you'll compare these last 2 columns here, see where they have the same number, and read over to get the quantity. Then to figure out what price they should charge, you should look at what price goes to that quantity that you just found. So if it was 3, then your price would be 900 because 3 and 900 go together. Total profits, again, you can get that from the table because it's something you would have found. And then if you want to shade it in, profit is the difference between the price and the average total cost times the quantity. So you would look for the price and the average total cost, mark those 2, that gives you the height, and then go all the way to the quantity and shade that in. The next question wants you to label the graph with the perfectly competitive equilibrium price and quantity, and label it as PE and QE. So for these, you would look for where the demand curve intersects marginal cost. So you're looking for essentially where price is equal to marginal cost. So you would compare that price column and the marginal cost column, see where they're the same, and that'll give you Q, and then whatever price that is the P. And then your last question is just to compare what you got in your first question to what you get in question 4. So you should see that the monopolist has a higher price and produces fewer, but you can see a little more detail once you get the numbers.